Welcome to the Wednesday night Bible study, where we are continuing our story of Daniel from the Old Testament. This is our fourth installment of Daniel. We're looking at the second half of Daniel chapter 2, starting with verse 31 this week. Now, if you remember last week, King Nebuchadnezzar has a recurring dream he's troubled about. And he asks, or he orders his magicians and his enchanters and his sorcerers and his astrologers to tell him what he had dreamed, not just an interpretation. Tell me what I dreamed and then interpret it. But they can't do that. They can't tell him his dream. So he orders all of his soothsayers and his fortune tellers killed. And then Daniel comes to the king and asks for and receives a little time. Because he is, in fact, even though he wasn't there, he is in that group of soothsayers and fortune tellers. So Daniel and his buddies pray, and the mystery is revealed to Daniel. The king asks if Daniel can tell what the king dreamed and interpret it. And let's read again what he told the king in Daniel chapter 2, verse 27. Daniel replied, "No wise man, enchanter, magician, or diviner can explain to the king the mystery he has asked about. But there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries. He has shown King Nebuchadnezzar what will happen in days to come." And then he very humbly adds in verse 30, "As for me, this mystery has been revealed to me not because I have greater wisdom than other living men, but so that you, O king, may know the interpretation and that you may understand what went through your mind." So for me, the main point of this whole chapter, the king having his dream, and then now we're in the situation where Daniel's about to interpret this dream. The main point is not prophecy, even though this is going to be a prophetic thing. I look at this, I'm focusing on this as a model of a man, Daniel, being used by God. So a man exhibiting faith, courage, and we'll see use of prayer, thanking God, praising God, giving God the credit. And it's also the beginnings of God's work on a pagan king. So what Daniel is about to present is the future. It is prophetic. It covers the time from then until the subjugation of Gentile powers to Israel's Messiah. Jesus spoke of this time span in Luke chapter 21, verse 24. I have this here. "Jerusalem will be trampled on by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled." So there's this whole period where the Gentiles are in control up until the Lord's second coming. So let's read the dream. As we read it, imagine we're in King Nebuchadnezzar's court. The king is sitting on his throne. He's probably doubtful at first that this young kid would come through with anything. But then imagine him moving to the edge of his throne as his eyes are widening and he hears this. "You looked, O king, and there before you stood a large statue, an enormous, dazzling statue, awesome in appearance. The head of the statue was made of pure gold, its chest and arms of silver, its belly and thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, its feet partly of iron and partly of baked clay. While you were watching, a rock was cut out, but not by human hands. It struck the statue on its feet of iron and clay and smashed them. Then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold were broken into pieces at the same time and became like chaff on a threshing floor in the summer. The wind swept them away without leaving a trace. But the rock that struck the statue became a huge mountain and filled the whole earth." Apparently, what Daniel just revealed about the dream was exactly correct because the king doesn't stop him. He goes through the whole dream. Daniel then continues with the interpretation in verse 36. "This was the dream, and now we will interpret it to the king." I find the "we" kind of curious here. We will interpret it to the king. Is Daniel saying, is it God in himself? Or is it his three buddies in himself? Or is he just using an editorial plural of we? But we will interpret it to the king. I'm thinking it's God and poor, lowly, humble Daniel are about to interpret the dream. You, O king, are the king of kings. Now that sounds like, is this a schmooze job? It's kind of weird hearing Daniel speak so highly of the king. But just imagine, it's not really a schmooze job. In that world at that time, you could say it was a fact. He is the king of kings. He has an empire over the world. But unlike the subservient respect the other wise men gave the king, Daniel goes on with further truth. The God of heaven has given you dominion and power and might and glory. It's all true. It's not just schmooze talk. In your hands he has placed mankind and the beasts of the field and the birds of the air. Wherever they live, he has made you ruler over them all. You are that head of gold. So by divine appointment, Nebuchadnezzar was given the position of ruler over all mankind, as well as the beasts and the birds. Very similar to the position God gave man at the time of creation. If you remember in your readings of Genesis in chapter 1, then God said, let us make man in our image, in our likeness, and let them rule over the fish of the sea and the birds of the air, over the livestock, over all the earth, and over all the creatures that move along the ground. So this is similar to what Daniel is saying is true for Nebuchadnezzar. He's the ruler over it all. Daniel declares that Nebuchadnezzar is the statue's head of gold. So this head represents the kingdom, not just the king, but the kingdom of Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar being its leader. Let's continue. After you, another kingdom will rise, inferior to yours. So, the second portion of the statue, which would be the chest and the arms of silver, back in verse 32, if you want to go back and look at that, it had the chest of arms and arms of silver. It's barely mentioned in either the dream or this interpretation. But we can identify this second kingdom. Remember, the first kingdom is Babylonia, the Babylonian Empire. The second kingdom is the Medo-Persian Empire. In fact, in Daniel chapter 5, coming up later on, verse 28 through 31, we'll see this transition. Daniel, he's reading and interpreting the handwriting on the wall. Tells King Belshazzar, and that's a successor of Nebuchadnezzar, so it's a Babylonian king who's the successor. Your kingdom, in verse 28 of chapter 5, your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. So that hasn't happened yet, but here he is predicting this from the dream from the king. And then in verse 30, that very night, Belshazzar, king of the Babylonians, was slain, and Darius the Mede took over the kingdom. So there, later on in Daniel, we see that is fulfilled. An interesting fact about this is just as there are two arms, there are two nations, Media, and Persia. And they together defeated and conquered Babylon in 539 BC, a historical fact. We continue on, second half of verse 39. Next, a third kingdom, one of bronze, will rule over the whole earth. So, the belly and thighs of bronze, which comes from verse 32 in the dream about the statue, that represented the third kingdom to arise. And historically, we know, but they didn't know at the time, that in 330 BC, Alexander the Great defeated the Medo-Persians and began the Grecian Empire. The third kingdom, ruling over the whole earth, as it says, seemingly did happen. Alexander's conquest extended his empire as far east as India. And then let's move on to the fourth kingdom. Verse 40. Finally, there will be a fourth kingdom, strong as iron, for iron breaks and smashes everything. And as iron breaks things to pieces, so it will crush and break all the others. Just as you saw the feet and toes were partly of baked clay and partly of iron, so this will be a divided kingdom. Yet it will have some of the strength of iron in it, even as you saw iron mixed with clay. As the toes were partly iron and partly clay, so this kingdom will be partly strong and partly brittle. And just as you saw the iron mixed with baked clay, so the people will be a mixture, and will not remain united any more than iron mixes with clay. The fourth kingdom, legs of iron, coming from verse 33 of the image, generally agreed by scholars to be the Roman Empire. This thing about the iron legs breaking, smashing, and crushing is a good description of ancient Rome. They conquered the Greeks in 63 BC. We could spend a whole lot of time just in unpacking this about how this is the Roman Empire and how it came to be, the significance of this combination of clay and iron. We'll talk about it maybe if we get time more in a minute. But first I want to look at the statue and the four kingdoms together. And I don't know if you can see this picture very well, but as the metals go from head to foot, starting with the Babylonian Empire and ending up in Rome, the metals become stronger. We go from gold to silver to bronze to iron. Each successive kingdom becomes stronger. Each successive kingdom covers more geographic area, and each kingdom lasted longer than the ones before. Babylon lasted for 87 years. Medo-Persia had their reign for 210 years. Greece was 230, and an undivided Roman Empire lasted over 500 years. And you could say it still exists today, the Roman Empire. So Daniel spent considerably more time describing this fourth empire. The part about the mixture of iron and clay has various interpretations, and I'll just overview this. Remember, our main focus is on how Daniel is dealing with this, not really in discussing the prophecy, but it's so fascinating. So let me talk about it a little bit. First, iron and clay don't mix, right? You heat them up to melting, pour them into a mold, let them cool, and they remain separate. We should all try that as an experiment. We read it was a divided kingdom, partly strong and partly brittle. So Rome succeeded in conquering many territories, but never could seem to unite the people, form a united empire. People were a mixture, as that prediction was. The empire was strong organizationally, but weak morally, a lot of scholars say. Imperialism and democracy were united unsuccessfully. So you got the iron and you got the clay. Iron-like will of authority competing against clay-like voice of the people. We can go one step further and say that the Roman Empire, although dead as a political entity, is in fact still here today. It's the Western world, far from being united peoples, and still having trouble uniting government authority and democratic ideals. So these toes of iron and clay could be representing the world today and the days to come until the end of kingdoms as we know it. And that's described in the next verses. So hopefully that gave you a little bit of an idea of what was going on with this fourth kingdom. But in verse 45 we read, "In the time of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that will never be destroyed, nor will it be left to another people. It will crush all those kingdoms and bring them to an end, but it will itself endure forever." Now this is prediction that hasn't even happened for us yet, right? Yes, it's true that Medo-Persia took over Babylon. It's true that Greece took over the Medo-Persians. It's true that the Roman Empire then took over. It's true that that's what we are into dealing with today. But now he's talking about even future for us. So let's continue on that. This is the meaning of the vision of the rock cut out of a mountain, but not by human hands. Let's see. Where is this? But not by human hands. A rock that broke the iron, the bronze, the clay, the silver, and the gold to pieces. The great God has shown the king what will take place in the future, even our future. The dream is true and the interpretation is trustworthy. So, look at that again. Isn't Daniel talking about the return of Jesus Christ? I believe so, and hopefully you do too. Read again from verse 45. Let's see. Where it talks about a rock that broke the iron, the bronze, the clay, and the silver and the gold to pieces. Christ is often referred to as the rock. Christ came in days of the Roman Empire. Jesus Christ of Nazareth came, but he didn't destroy it then. Christ is this chief cornerstone today. He will be the smiting stone at the second coming. The stone will crush and end all the kingdoms. The new kingdom will be perfect, politically, morally, economically. And that is the future. And the interpretation is trustworthy. Well, let's read now how Nebuchadnezzar reacts to what Daniel told him. Is he going to throw him in the dungeon or what? Verse 46, Then King Nebuchadnezzar fell prostrate before Daniel and paid him honor and ordered that an offering and incense be presented to him. So the king honors and praises Daniel first off. The king said to Daniel, Surely your God is the God of gods and the Lord of kings and the revealer of mysteries, for you are able to reveal the mystery. So next he honors and praises God. Notice he says, your God. As far as we can tell, that's King Nebuchadnezzar is adding this Jewish God in with his other gods. But he's saying this is a pretty powerful God. He is the God of gods. He's not really ready to take the plunge to say he's going to be my God. The king is not saying that. But it's a start. And then let's look what he did next. Then the king placed Daniel in a high position and lavished many gifts on him. He made him ruler over the entire province of Babylon and placed him in charge of all its wise men. Moreover, at Daniel's request, the king appointed Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, remember his three buddies. He appointed them administrators over the province of Babylon, while Daniel himself remained at the royal court. So that's where we end chapter 2, and that's where we end the interpretation of the king's dream. Daniel and his buddies are doing pretty good right now, don't you think, aren't they? And that ends chapter 2. And that ends our study today. We do have a powerful, wise God who uses people like Daniel to show his power and his strength, including the eventual second coming of Jesus Christ is predicted here. So you all take care and be safe, and may the Lord be with you.